All right, g'day. Grab a seat. It's good to be with you guys again. It's been really fun for me the last few weeks being here. I've actually learned a lot myself, so thank you for that. It's been great. My daughter Ellie was 6 years old, and we were on holidays down in Denmark. She's in her first year of school, and we're sitting around the dinner table, and she says, "I know some swear words." She's 6, all right? She says, "I know the but word, I know the shit word, and I know the foot word." Okay. Now, if I was back home in Quins or Yanchep, I'd make fun of, it's probably all those South African kids you've been hanging around, you know teaching you that stuff. But I know that any South Africans here can laugh with me at that. But anyway, we said, "Well, okay, tell us." She said, "I can't tell you. I can't say those words." We said, "Well, maybe you can tell us one word." No. Danelle says, "What about the shit word?" She's looking really like she's been caught out, you know. Danelle says, "Was it?" And she uses the shit word that you're thinking of. And my daughter looks like she goes, "No." Like she'd never heard that word before. Great parenting move, Danelle. You say, "Well, maybe you can tell us what it is." You see her breathe deeply and go, "Shut up." We go, "Oh, I hope you don't say that." No, I don't say that. Good girl. What about the but word? You know the but word. Bum. And we laughed again. We said, "Oh, Ellie, okay." And I'm not feeling so worried about the foot word now. In fact, I'm feeling I might have had a part in this one. The foot word, fart. Okay, we could breathe again. But we sent her to school to learn some stuff. And she learned other stuff along the way. It just happens when you hang out with people, you learn stuff. As believers, we learn stuff about what it means to follow Jesus. And we do some of that here, and you probably meet in connect groups and around the place. But you might spend 3 or 4 hours of your week doing that. You spend far more of your time learning in the world you're part of, immersed in the algorithms that throw at you information that they think you need to hear. And for many of us, we're far more discipled by the internet than we are by our church community. Some of us perhaps aren't even aware that the culture we're swimming in has entangled us in its net, and we don't even realise. We're all susceptible. In this series, as we look at work and rest, it'd be ideal to look at a 6-to-1, work sermon to 1 rest ratio kind of thing, because that's kind of how God set it up. But that'd be a bit of a long series. So we're going to jump straight to one of the really important and really valuable parts of what it means to be at work in God's community, and that is the significance of rest. That rest is called Sabbath, from the Hebrew Shabbat, which means to stop. And maybe the name Sabbath trips you up, because it did me when I was a kid, because Sabbath meant wearing itchy clothes and not playing soccer, and Sabbath felt like a day for not smiling. That's what it felt like when I was a kid, Very somber. So today, if Sabbath is a block for you, just substitute the word rest and it will mean the same thing. In case you've been away for a few weeks, we've been thinking about work. And we've said that work is good. God gave us work so that it could give purpose to our lives and so we could serve one another. We said it's good. Second week, we looked at our vocation, our sense of calling. And how do you arrive at a sense of vocation if you don't have a burning bush or if you don't have a bright light thundering to you out of the sky? We looked at the story of Ruth. And we said work is good. However, for some people, work is compulsive, addictive. It's exhilarating, it's exciting, it's intoxicating. It's all those kinds of things. It can be incredibly seductive. It feeds our ego, and every broken thing inside of us seems to feel better when we close a deal, when we achieve a goal, when we just get that praise from our boss. And then we live in a culture that calls us continually to this elusive picture of an aspirational life. You know, a nicer home in a more prestigious suburb because you deserve that, and your kids will go to a better school, and then you need to get a nicer car and better holidays. There's always something to aspire to. I'm sure you feel it. My friend, who's also a pastor, told me the story of his kid coming home from school one day and said, "Hey, Dad, you know, all the other kids seem to have all this really cool stuff, and you know, their dads, they work FIFO, they go away, they earn lots of money, and you're a pastor and you don't really earn as much. You know, have you thought about basically, you know, taking a trip and go and do a bit of FIFO for us and bring me some toys?" That's kind of the tone of the conversation. And he says, "Well, you know, you realise if I did that, I wouldn't be around for your sports carnivals and your assemblies and some of this other stuff, you know. It'd change the way our life worked." And, you know, he says, you wouldn't want that, would you? And he says, no, I wouldn't. He says, "So can we send Mum?" True story. Smart kid. We have learnt some ways to live that aren't aligned with Jesus' way, but that feel good for a time and that feed something in us. So there's nothing wrong with living in a really nice house in a nice place, or having a good car or a boat or all that sort of stuff. But it's when we are unknowingly seduced into the whole package, when we have stopped the wrestle. The wrestle, you know, Tanya's talking about coming back from India, and there's a wrestle. I've just come back from Bali. There's a wrestle seeing people live in a whole different place in life to where we're at. When we stop wrestling, we're in trouble. It's that day we discover that the core of our lives is no longer focused on Jesus and his way, but instead the upwardly mobile aspirational script. Plus church on Sunday. Work is good, but more work isn't necessarily better, and endless work is not utopia. Today, if you feel like you are working harder than you should be, then I want to invite you to take a rest. Not just today, but to make rest a posture in your life. Resting isn't weak. Resting isn't weak. If that's all you need to hear today, then that's maybe enough. Resting's a really important part of a healthy life. So come with me, I want to show you what the scriptures say about rest. And we're going to start in Genesis, and we're going to have a look at the Old Testament for a while, and then we're going to look at a couple of passages in the New Testament. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 1 to 3. Rest is part of the original creation. It's there before sin comes into the world. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he'd been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. A 6-to-1 ratio working week was built into the order of creation before sin. So rest is part of a good world, not a concession to a broken world. But as you can imagine, as creation's been tainted by sin, so now our ability to enjoy rest has also been tainted. The next reference to the Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. And it's the longest commandment by quite a bit. It says, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy." God blesses rest and makes it holy. In this passage in Exodus, the call is to remember. Here's a bunch of people who've spent a long time in slavery, and slaves don't get a day off. So it's possible that the idea of Sabbath has gone from their collective memory. So it's said here is remember. Remember the Sabbath? Remember. God puts it back in there. He says, don't forget this vital part of your life. No one's to do any work. The whole community at rest. I can't even imagine that. Even your animals are at rest. Possibly not possible in a world that we live in today. But in that practice, the Hebrew people reclaim a vital part of their story. And they also introduce others to the story. The foreigners, the aliens living amongst them, get to see that, hey, this is who our God is like. He says we get to rest. The next time it's mentioned is in Deuteronomy, when the Ten Commandments are repeated, and it's said with the language of observe. So gone from remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. And throughout the history of the Hebrew people, Sabbath was intended to be an integral part of the lives that they lived. In fact, it's a commandment with the death penalty attached for those who don't adhere to it. Which seems like a bit of overkill to me. But maybe God is saying it's that important. So what exactly do we mean by Sabbath? Technically, a 24-hour period each week where we down tools, we don't work, and we devote the day to rest, recovery for the soul, and to God. That's what we're talking about as a Sabbath. A Sabbath to the Lord, a day created to be holy. A good friend of mine starting up a business, and he's 5 years in, and he's over the startup, but he hasn't got it really cranking yet. And he is busting his gut every day. He's not a Christian guy, so he wouldn't call himself a Christian. So he probably works, 12 hours every day. And he said to me one day, I'm thinking about taking a Sabbath. He said, I've been going 6 months without a break. I need a Sabbath. And then we both laughed. I said, dude, that ain't a Sabbath. One Sunday in 6 months is not a Sabbath. That's just desperation. But this is how many people live. He's a really high capacity person, and he knows if he works really, really hard, maybe his business will get there ahead of time. And yet God says, nah, you need a rest, man. You need a rest. There is debate around where Sabbath fits into our Christian faith today. Some would say it's in the Ten Commandments and we haven't ditched the others, so we shouldn't ditch the Sabbath. Some would argue that we need a literal 24-hour period, even observing some of the similar things to what the Jewish people did. If you follow John Mark Comer, he's a pretty popular teacher in Christian circles at the moment, especially amongst younger people. He'd be an advocate for a literal 24-hour Sabbath every week. The other perspective says we need to embrace Sabbath as a work-rest rhythm. And we need to find a cycle that works for us and the life we live. And I'm going to show you a little bit of where that comes from in the New Testament, just a couple of passages. So first one's in Romans. Romans 14 says one person considers, Paul's writing to them, he says one person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God. And whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. So Paul calls on us to simply own our own conviction around issues that may be contested. You could go to Galatians 4, where Paul's writing to a bunch of people who've kind of got hemmed in by law again. And he's basically saying to them, guys, you don't have to observe these special days and special seasons anymore. So on a theological note, you can take this either way. And as we delve into it, you might kind of go, I think I need to go this way, I think I need to go this way. What you can't do is say my way's right and your way's wrong. There are different ways to look at this. I'm going to say personally, I favour the work-rest-rhythm approach. And I'll say more about that later. So to try and give shape to what I think the Bible means for us in terms of taking a Sabbath, I'm going to give you 5 ideas. First one I want to just get out of the way is what I'm going to call dumb rules and finger waving. Dumb rules annoy me. I don't know about you, but I just put a dumb rule. I remember when we were leaving Les Murdy to go and live in Butler, one of my jobs was to pick up the tiles and Joondalup on the way through so we could deliver them to the tiler and get the house built. And I got to Joondalup and we stopped at the tile shop and I went in to get them and I realised I'd left my credit card back in Les Murdy. I said, "Sir, I know the number." He said, we can't take the number. We need your card." I said, "But if I rang you, you'd take the number." He said, "Yeah, we can't do it in person." So I said, "Is that one of your cards?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "What are you doing?" I said, I'm ringing you." That's a dumb rule, right? I remember growing up around some dumb rules. And just that was part of my having to come to grips with this idea of Sabbath. Sabbath is not about that. Sabbath is not intended to tie you up in self-defeating, silly rules. In fact, I'm sure that's why Jesus spends so much of his time misbehaving on the Sabbath. He heals people intentionally on the Sabbath, as if to go, "Guys, really? You think this is bad? You think this is wrong? What has our world become?" That's what he's saying. So if Sabbath feels like nothing but a lot of weird thou shalt nots, then it probably ain't a Sabbath. You know, where issues began originally is when the Jewish leaders had the law. They said, we don't want people violating the law, so we're going to put some fences in front of the law. And gradually those fences got wider and wider and wider. You know what? Neil Watson and I remember we drove across Australia when we were I was 17, had P plates. Neil, a few more. He was a few more years on. But we drove across then. I remember you went to the Great Australian Bight then, and you could go like this, which I would never do because it's scary, but you could do that. You go to the Great Australian Bight now, and you'd barely know it's there. Because the fence there. That's what they did with the law. They put fences around so you couldn't violate the law. But in doing so, they tied people up with these heavy burdens. It was hard to know what the law was. It said you couldn't work on the Sabbath. That means you couldn't bake, you couldn't mow the lawn, change the oil. What about walking the dog? Is that making the dog work? Going to the gym for a workout? Ooh, I don't know. Yeah, Orthodox Jews have these really long lists of things you're allowed to do and don't do. I'll flick it up there so you can see it. I'm not going to read them all, but that was a list that I came across. An example of how tetchy this stuff gets is that on Sabbath, you're not allowed to finish tasks, and tearing paper is considered finishing a task. So Orthodox Jews have individual sheets of toilet paper because you're not allowed to go like that. Crazy, eh? Wow. Do you know your fridge probably has a Sabbath mode? I was trying to hack mine one day because something had gone wrong with it, and I discovered that the fridge has a Sabbath mode, that you can actually set it so the light doesn't come on Sabbath, so it's not doing any work. I don't know how that works with a compressor, but it has a Sabbath mode. Trust me, Google it. The law wasn't bad, but as fences were put around it, people got bound up, and it did not end well. So if you've known Sabbath as angry, self-righteous, finger-waving at dumb rules, then you can put that one away. And I want to give you 5 ways to look at it, fairly briefly each one, but I'm going to give you 5 ways to look at it. I hope will be helpful. Number 1, Sabbath as gift. We worship the God who blesses his people with rest. The God we know wants us to live in such a way that our life is beautiful and rich, not compressed and rigid because we have so much to do and so many rules not to break. It seems like God just knew that we were wired to work, that we would possibly take this whole thing too far. We consumed it. And he comes along and he says, "Stop. I want you to stop." That whole death penalty thing for the Sabbath, I think he's going, serious. This is really serious. Rest matters. I don't want to be insensitive to anyone who was affected by the pandemic in a really bad way here, but for us, during that time, we were leading one church and planning another one. And we're doing that during half the week. And the other half of the week, I was running my business because reticulation was an essential service, believe it or not. And I was also writing a book. So I was pretty busy in 2021. And then they said, you can't go to church anymore. You can meet in homes. And it was like a cool breeze that just blown through our life. We went, I had not realised how hard we were going until we actually got to stop. So if we don't follow the literal Jewish script, how do we know what to do and what not to do on the Sabbath? Marva Dawn's written a book called Keeping the Sabbath Holy. And one of the things I like that she says, figure out what work is for you and don't do it. I think that's really clever. Figure out what work is for you and don't do it. And it's going to be different for different people. So my wife loves gardening, and for me, gardening is toil. So she will go gardening on the Sabbath because that's rest and recovery. For me, it used to be a punishment as a kid, so I hate it. What's work for you? Otherwise, begin with the idea of Sabbath as a gift in mind. Implement firm boundaries, not rigid laws. Figure out what replenishes you. What do you do that brings joy to your soul? Avoid the draining stuff. Pre-plan food, pre-plan chores, if that's the way you want to go. John Mark Comer in his book and his podcast, he has a lot of stuff on this. So if you kind of want to follow that up, go Google him and there'll be heaps of stuff. But Sabbath is built into the very order of creation. Our rest is a gift to be enjoyed. Second one, Sabbath as resistance. Now I've stolen this idea directly from Walter Brueggemann, who wrote a book by that title. I'm going to read to you what he says, because Sabbath is a very powerful countercultural statement to the way in which we're accustomed to living. He says this: in our contemporary context of the rat race of anxiety, the celebration of Sabbath is an act of both resistance and alternative. It is a resistance because it is a visible insistence that our lives are not defined by the production and consumption of commodity goods. Such an act of resistance requires enormous intentionality and communal reinforcement amid the barrage of seductive pressures from the insatiable insistences of the market, with its intrusions into every part of our life, from the family to the national budget. But Sabbath is not only resistance, it is alternative. The alternative on offer is the awareness and practice of the claim that we are situated on the receiving end of the gifts of God. Our God loves us enough to say, take a rest, and I will care for you in that rest. So we are choosing, as Romans 12:2 says, to not conform to the world around us, but to live in a different way. Riverview, a good news community on mission, it is good news to the world in which we live that you can stop and rest legitimately for a whole day of the week. You can take that off. Brueggemann says we can say no. He says we are ruled by a pharaoh who is the economic order in which we inhabit. It's relentless in its demands of us, and it can seduce us into its way. I don't know how many small business owners there are here today, but if you're a small business owner, chances are the same thing will happen to you each week as happens to me. I get probably 2 or 3 calls from an overseas voice, and it's a marketing company, and they want to help me grow my business, and they want to help me increase my search engine optimization, they want to help me get more business and become more successful. And they go through a whole spiel. You know that spiel where you're supposed to go, and I just stay silent until they get to the end. They say, so, would you like to sign up with us and we will help you get more work, more money, more whatever? I said, no, thank you. I've got enough. Now, that's a real dent in the script. There is nothing in the responses to that reply that they can manage. To have enough just doesn't register. So actually, I've got enough work. In fact, I'm a little bit too busy. Sometimes I say that. I can decrease the amount of work? Don't you want more money, sir? Don't you want a better house? I actually quite like the place I live in. We've actually got enough. That's a weird thing to say in the world in which we live in. But we are able to say enough. We need to say enough. And you know, some of you are in those exploding jobs like teaching, where you go home and you prepare for the next day, and you could prepare till midnight and you could still do a better job. Sometimes you just got to say, enough, enough, it's good enough. In the book I wrote about bivocational pastoring, I would tell pastors who were working a couple of days a week, who all want to preach a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10 sermon, just preach a 7 out of 10. Lower your standards. It sounds terrible, but 7 out of 10 is still good. It's good enough. You don't have to stay up till late at night and strain every other relationship just to get the best done. Seriously, some of us need to restrain our ambition. The ambition that drives us late into the night to the detriment of other relationships. When we truly rest, when we say no to the economic machine that drives so much of our world, then we experience some of the goodness that God speaks of. Number 3, Sabbath as trust. If you're going to take a day off, then you are trusting that either there will be enough money coming in or enough work coming in outside of that to provide for you, and you are trusting God for that. Marva Dawn again says a great benefit of Sabbath keeping is that we learn to let God take care of us, not by becoming passive and lazy, but in the freedom of giving up our feeble attempts to be God in our own lives. I think sometimes we think if I can just keep going, I can make this thing work. You know the story of the Hebrew people in the desert and the manna. You know, they go walking in the desert and God provides food for them every day, and he says, go and take enough for the day. Don't take too much because it's going to go off, and I'll provide some next day as well. So don't do that. Sure enough, some take too much and it goes off. Who would have thought? And he says, and when Sabbath comes around, get twice as much the day before so that you're ready for that day. And don't go out on Sabbath because you're resting on Sabbath. So, of course, some go out on Sabbath and there's nothing there. God says, take enough and I will provide for you. Brueggemann writes of the massive difference between restfulness and restlessness. What does contentment look like in a world that exists because our economy is built on accessing our internal discontent? God provides, and he provides enough. That's certainly been our story for as long as I can remember. Trusting a God who always provides enough means you don't have to work frantically. Means you can be content with a satisfactory house and a satisfactory car rather than the best. You know, I think I told you we've done 2 laps of Australia. Take a drink, Andrew. 2 laps of Australia, and the first one we did it in this amazing 1996 GQ Patrol. It was low kilometres, it was an immaculate car when I bought it. And I sold it when we came back a few years later, and I always regretted selling that car. It was one of those things that I loved, you know. I love cars. Someone once said women wear clothes and men wear cars. So kind of I do love cars. But we came back from our second trip around Australia in 2021, and as we pulled into Yanchep, there in the parking bay opposite the cafe was my old car. It had now changed hands twice, and I knew the 2 owners, and it had a for sale sign on it. Yeah. And I said to my wife, I'm buying that. She said, no, you're not. I said, I am. I love that car. It's for sale. I might never get a chance to buy that car back again. She said, we're not having another car. We've got 2 good cars. We don't need a 3rd car. I know. I'm not saying we need it. I just want it. And she was flat no. Anyway, I rang the guy. I said, can I just come around and have a drive of the old car just to see if I like it? So I went round and he gave me the keys and I hopped in, and you know, it was 1996 it was made. This is 2021. And it's had 2 more owners since me. And they haven't been kind owners, let's put it that way. Anyway, I hopped in and there's bits hanging off and the fuel gauge doesn't work and the electric window doesn't work. And I started driving it up towards Two Rocks and I thought, this thing's a pig. I can't drive this car. Yeah, a lot changes in car technology between 1996 and 2025. I thought, I can't drive this thing in 2021. Anyway, I came home and said, thanks, mate, but I think I'll leave it. And I went home, I said to Nell, I said, honey, just so you know, I'm not going to buy the car. She says, of course you're not. I said, I drove it and I don't like it. She says, you realise what you've just done? You've just told me that you have $10,000 to spend on a toy. I said, yeah. She said, well, she's been working in Bali orphanages for the last 17 years, helping them out. She said, she showed me a picture of a car. She said, this is what the orphanage are currently using to drive around. Sort of thing you'd find dumped out the back of Two Rocks. You know, the seats were ripped and there's rusted all through, and it looks ridiculous that anyone would even drive it. She said, I think I know what we could do with that $10,000. So I bought a van instead that someone else gets to drive because I have enough. But that's hard to get, isn't it, when you see things that you really, really want. Paul writes to Timothy, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we'll be content with that. No, we won't, but we'll try. Hey? My daughter learnt some swear words in the educational system she was part of. We have learnt some far more disturbing practices in the economic system that we are part of. We live in a world that says you've got to look out for number one, but the kingdom of God says it doesn't work like that. We're called to be content with enough money, enough stuff, and getting enough work done. 4, Sabbath as rhythm. This is kind of how I think it ought to work. I used to love driving old cars, and my plan was I'd just drive an old car, and when it fixes it, I'd break it. And when it breaks, I'd fix it and just keep on going. And in 2015, I flipped the script and I bought a brand new car. Quite a miracle. But I bought a brand new car, and with a brand new car comes service intervals, right? So if you get a brand new car, you know, every 15,000 Ks, you've got to drop it in and you've got to get it looked after, you've got to get the oil changed, you've got to get... Imagine I took you to buy a used car that had 250,000 Ks on the clock, and we looked in the service book and there was nothing. And we said to the guy, what's the deal? He goes, still goes. You wouldn't buy the car, would you? You wouldn't. I wouldn't. Because you know that sooner or later that thing's going to blow up. That's kind of how it is with us. If we don't observe the service interval once a week, take a day off, something's going to blow up. As I said, I lean more towards rhythm than a set day. When it comes to how Old Testament commands carry into the New Testament law, or carry into New Testament life, we know the Mosaic law is done with, right? 10 Commandments gone. Jesus just says it's like this. You love God and you love other people, and that way you keep the whole law. And from there we're told we're given the Holy Spirit, not as a law enforcement person, but as a guide, as a helper to guide us into all truth, okay? A literal 24-hour Sabbath every week is not a thing every Christian must do to be right with God. And the death penalty is no longer enforced, which is good. But if we think of how Jesus spoke of other aspects of the law and then look at him in the Sermon on the Mount, it'd be interesting to think how he'd respond to Sabbath. You know, he says in the Sermon on the Mount, you've heard it said, do not murder. But I say to you, don't even get angry with someone. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But I say you don't even lust in your heart. What would he do with Sabbath if he translated that into New Testament language? You've heard it say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But I say to you, rest is found in me, and it does not depend on special days or practices. I think that's something like what he would say. When I suggest rhythm rather than day, I'm thinking of people who are shift workers, fireys, nurses, police. Thinking of people who work FIFO, seasonal workers who have to go hard for a period and then can back off a bit. There's more than one way to rest. But I would say, start with a 6 and 1, 6 days on, 1 day off ratio and work from there. That's a good guide to start with. I'm not a fan of kind of going 6 weeks on, 1 week off. I don't think that's a good idea. All right, I think it's a bad idea. So let each person work out the rhythm that works for them and their family. Finally, Sabbath as life. Hebrews 4 is a pretty complex piece of scripture, but essentially it speaks of entering rest in Jesus by faith. It says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So when Jesus says, come to me, all you who labour and are weighed down, and I will give you rest for your souls. He's speaking of a life centred on him. That means we're no longer bound by religious obligations or by striving for any kind of success. Jesus calls us to live in his rest as a way of life, as a posture, and that is rich and beautiful. Doesn't mean we don't work hard, doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue success, but it's referring to the posture with which we engage our work. A few years back, I was going to one of the Baptist pastors' conferences, and the guys who were organising the conference were preparing some of those little clips, the conference, little video clips. The conference was titled Returning to the Well, the idea of going back to the source and drawing from the well. And they wanted to do a clip on me and how I did that. And they came up and did the video, and as we were talking, they said, so tell us, Andrew, how you returned to the well. And as I spoke, I had one of those moments where you go, wow. I said, I don't think we return to the well so much anymore as we try to live by the well. And as I said those words, I thought, that's different, but that's cool. I like that. I actually feel like that's more how we're intended to live, by the well, rather than going away and then coming back. Funny thing was, they didn't use that. They didn't think it was very good. I thought it was one of my moments of great insight, but it got ditched, cut on the floor. When we live and work from a place of rest in Jesus, we know that 6 and 1 doesn't mean just busting your gut for 6 days, absolutely flat out, and then go, and then doing it again. Right? You know, people who fast only to binge eat the rest of the week, you know, it kind of misses the point, doesn't it? And I say sometimes it's blurred because when you look at Jesus, you know, Matthew chapter 14, he's just healed a bunch of people and he's tired and he goes, I got to get away. I'm going to go to the other side of the lake and take a breather. And he goes over the other side of the lake and he gets there, puts his feet up and realises that they've found him. He's trying to hide out, hang out, get some chill time, and they've found him. And he goes, oh, you know what? Let's just do it. Let's just heal some more people and let's feed some people. So Jesus is able to go, rest matters, but there's times when I'm willing to bend on it. I just spent 8 days, 3 days in Bali at a wedding and 5 days in Nusa Lembongan. And the wedding was kind of not work, but kind of work because I had to prepare it and had to wear a suit. So that's always work. Then we went to Nusa Lembongan and while I was there, the idea was that we just hang with our family and go surfing and chill and prepare a sermon. And you know the most enjoyable part was actually this. I was sitting on my bed just typing away. I was learning some good stuff. Really enjoyed that. I was hoping the surf would have been more enjoyable, but when there's 40 people in the water and you're 61 and they're all younger, fitter, stronger, hungrier than you, it's not much fun. So I say rest and work sometimes can be mingled, depending on how you live your life. You know, when we were younger, we had young kids, a very, very busy life. We said, no, we need a day. We need a day where we're going, no, we're done. Phone down, not touching anything, leave us alone. So you've got to work out what works for you at different stages of life. One more thought. Brigham, and this is actually really important. It was Brigham who said Sabbath cannot be practiced by isolated individuals. We're part of a community. I think it's up there. I think you've got to have a community around you that supports you. How do you tell your kid he can't go to soccer practice on Sunday morning because it's a Sabbath? You can't unless you've got a number of other families telling their kids that they can't go to soccer practice. The pressure of market ideology makes it almost impossible for a single person or single family to do this unless you're in a community that is generally supportive of it. So there's a call there to support one another in what we embody as the Sabbath. We live connected, so it's hard not to draw lines outside of that. When we live a life that is beautiful to others, inspiring and hope-giving, then I imagine we are preaching the gospel well. We're showing people what it looks like to be a good news community on mission. When other people speak to you about why your life looks more fulfilling than theirs, maybe take it as a hint that you're on the right track, because that may well happen. It happened to me with a young landscaper guy. When I first started my business, I only wanted to work north of the river, and I knew he was south of the river. So I rang him and said, hey, how about we just swap jobs? You get jobs up my way, send them to me, I'll send them down to you. Cool. We've been going about 3 or 4 years and occasional conversation. Then we found out we were both Christians. And he was about 25 years younger than me. And he'd ask me every now and then, he'd go, you look like you've got a better life than I have. What's going on? And he was young and ambitious, and he was trying to grow this business. And we'd have these conversations every 4 or 5 years. It's kind of on that frequency. How come I look at your life and it seems more enjoyable than mine? And then he set out and he said, I'm going to build this business. I'm going to make it the biggest. And he went, absolute helpful ever. He was getting up at 4 a.m, going to bed at midnight, just working crazy hours. And I'm thinking, I don't know where all this is going. His business was growing. And he called me and said, I'm selling it. I'm selling it all. And he dropped it all, sold it all. And he's now living at a sustainable pace. And you know, what I see of his life now looks beautiful. Maybe your life looks beautiful to someone else. Maybe the way in which you live is something that people can aspire towards. You know, each time I finish speaking here at Riverview, I see about 500 people in each service who are going to go back into the community, into the workplaces all over this city, and who are going to be the presence of Jesus. You know, when I speak at the church I'm part of in Yanchep, there's like 40 people, wouldn't even fill this centre square. It's a very different interaction. But this church gets to have an influence across the whole city. So I want to finish by encouraging you to enjoy the work God has given you. Be thankful for it and do your job as Jesus would as you go out this week. I want you to discern who God has made you to be, if you haven't already, and pursue your vocation as best you are able. And thirdly, prioritise rest. More than just a rest, a life that is beautiful, not just in its accoutrements and its acquisitions, but in its simplicity and its joy and its hospitality. Go and be those people, and that will have a massive impact on our city. Let me pray for you. Father, again, there's a bunch of people who are going to go out today back into the workplace, back into the community. And I want to pray that their lives would be lives that would be beautiful and attractive to the people who live amongst them, people who live around them, that their lives would create curiosity. Father, I pray for people today who are listening to the message of rest and feeling challenged by it and maybe feeling like they can't do it. I want to pray your Spirit would lead them to a place of trusting you and be able to work out what that rest can look like for them. Thank you again in Jesus' name. Amen.